Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller, you know the drill. And today it's another interview with one of Britain's leading writers and one of Britain's leading SF writers. He also writes mainstream fiction as well and textbooks. And we're talking about Chris Beckett, the winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Now, if you don't know Chris, I'll talk a little bit about him so you can sort of have an insight into his work. And we're going to talk over his novels today. Chris was born in 1955. He's a very well-educated chap. He has a degree in psychology, a master's degree in English studies, just the thing if you're a writer. He has a number of advanced qualifications in social work. He worked in social work for many years. I think it was sort of nearly 20 years. And he was a frontline social worker and also a team leader, leading a team of people looking after people with all sorts of issues and things. A really good, important work there. And he also lectures, or used to lecture, I think he's retired now, on social work and social care. And he has attended sort of universities, colleges, and he's lived in different cities around the UK. So he's a well-travelled and educated man, and that comes through in his fiction, which is fantastic. He's certainly one of my favourite contemporary writers at the moment in the UK. Now, Chris became a professional SF writer in 1990 when his first story was published in Interzone, and he kept publishing stories and getting lots of sort of acclaim from the readers of Interzone. And then in 2004, he published his first novel, The Holy Machine, and this is the Cosmos Wildside hardcover, and there was an A format paperback of this, which I'd love to have. So that's the same cover, and this is Chris's favourite cover for the book, and it's certainly mine as well. And I sell an awful lot of it in the paperback edition from Corvus, and I'll show you that during the video. It's a great place to start. It's very hard-edged, lots of great ideas in it. We'll talk about it during the video. Fantastic book as entry level for Chris's work if you're new to him. He started to issue collections with this one, The Turing Test, which came out in 2008 from Elastic Press, and this won the Edge Hill Prize for Best Short Story Collection of the UK in the UK, published that year. It was a 2009 prize for 2008 books. And it really is quite something. We'll talk about that as well. His second novel, Marcher, which is one of my favourites, is set in Bristol, which is not too far from where I live in Bath, in a city that both Chris and I know well. Is about funnily enough, an immigration officer who deals with migrants from another universe. It's a fantastic little book. I really recommend that as well. There's a revised edition from Newcon Press. They still hardcover, still in print, and there's trade paperback as well. There's a short story collection called The Peacock Cloak. And then you sort of got to a point where Chris really had a big splash with his trilogy, the Eden Trilogy, and this is the first of those, Dark Eden, won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and I say there are two sequels, and it's a classic world-building conceptual breakthrough SF tale. Lots of traditional stuff, but lots of sort of shocking stuff as well. And it's been likened to things like Lord of the Flies, though I would say maybe Brian Aldiss is possibly the more primary of influence, I would say. It's a great book and two great sequels. So another great one for you to go into if you're new to Chris. After working on the trilogy, he then moved into a new phase, and he started working on some really amazing social SF. And I first met him in 2017, where we did a bookshop event for America City. An absolutely beautiful book, and a fantastic book that is. He followed that up with the, I guess you could say, magical realist tainted Beneath the World at Sea, which I've only got around to reading recently, and it's fantastic, actually. A very beautiful book, as you see. He's published by Corvus. Then he took a look at some contemporary mores through an SF glass darkly in the wonderful Two Tribes, which is about Brexit, amongst other things. And his most recent novel, and for me his most stunning work so far, is the wonderfully ambiguous, complex and yet readable. And this is the thing with Chris, he's very, very readable, he's easy to read. And this is Tomorrow, which absolutely blew me away. So I'm looking forward to talking to him now. And without any further ado, let's get into the interview. Hi, Chris. It's been a long time, 2017. 5 years since we last met. I know we've been in touch on social media a little bit. Neither of us are big on that, but it's great to have you on the channel. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's great.
Absolute pleasure. And as you probably will have seen, I did an interview recently with Nina Allen. Do you know Nina? I imagine you do.
Yeah, know to say hello to. Yeah.
And Chris Priest as well, who you know Chris, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been mates for years and years, and it's just really great to reconnect with people because I can't believe it's been so long, but that's the whole COVID thing. I know we're all still saying it and it's still with us, but it really has sort of put a spanner in the chronological works, hasn't it? You know,
It
so
certainly has. No, there's a big chunk of years when you
yeah,
know we weren't really contacting people normally. I mean, actually, we could do things like this, of course, but then we gradually we got used to it. But yeah,
in some ways it was a good thing to have some time, wasn't it? I mean, I obviously, as you know, I work in retail, and it was one of those things where I managed to take some time out, but I didn't do much reading. I did watching lots of stuff, so I need another lockdown to read now. But there we go. Anyway, let's plunge into your work, because what I want to do today is sort of do an overview and cover your work, to sort of introduce it to people who know your work, so they can hear what you have to say, and also for people who are not familiar with it.
yeah,
And I guess we start the beginning. Obviously, your first story was published in Interzone way back in 1990, and
yeah,
you sort of plunged on ahead over many years then. And your first book then was Holy Machine from Cosmos Wildside. And
yes, yeah,
I have to say, when I read Holy Machine, it absolutely blew me away. I loved the sort of hard edges of it. I loved the combination of ideas, and the quality of the writing was just there for me, because I am a literary SF guy. And for people who don't know the book, if I do a quick description from my point of view, is set in a future world which is dominated by a sort of rise in religious fundamentalism, and there's one secular state, which is in Europe, isn't it? And the protagonist of the book decides to become a bit of a tourist and go outside the secular state to see the world. And unfortunately, he goes with his sex robot, and that has all sorts of implications. So, what inspired the book? You know, were you concerned about the sort of resurgence in religious fundamentalism in all sorts of parts of the globe? Was it that, or was there other concern? You know, where do the germs, the ideas come from?
Well, I think actually, although obviously the fiction is always much sort of rougher and more simple than reality, I think actually I'm quite proud of that book for being prescient, actually, because I think what I saw happening was people kind of reaction against kind of modernity, really, against science and rationality and all the rest of it, which I think a lot of people feel left out by. Really, they feel that it's basically like let the experts sort everything out, and people don't like that, and they start to react against it, and that's what happened in my book. It was called The Reaction. And it's a form of religious fundamentalisms of various kinds all over the world. Not always the same religious fundamentalism. The different religious groups didn't like each other, but that had happened all over the world. And then the kind of old technocratic elite had founded a kind of refuge for themselves in Europe, as you say, in a place called Illyria. So obviously that's where life is much more complicated than that. But I feel I was onto something. I feel I picked up a kind of I think where we first saw it in the Middle East, with the
Yes.
of the Shah and the rise of various kinds of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East, and I anticipated, which I feel I was correct in thinking, it would spill over into other countries as well. In fact, including into the Western countries, maybe not religious fundamentalism, but a reaction
Absolutely.
against,
Yeah.
the January 6th events last, after Biden was elected, for example,
Yes. Yeah.
that kind of thing was very much how was the background to my kind of book, but my idea for the book rather.
Yeah, because fundamentalism has risen in politics as well. We call it populism, but it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? So
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is, and although I don't like how it manifests itself, I am sympathetic to the psychology behind it. I feel I can understand why people react against modernity, and so it's quite a common theme in my books, actually, that kind of reaction. So I don't like the manifestation of it, but I can understand the reasons for it. Well, I feel I can. Obviously, it's a bit arrogant to say I can, but I feel like I think I've got some kind of feeling for it anyway. See what I mean?
Definitely.
And so that was the background to the big picture in the book, and the the young man, the shy young man, falling in love with a sex robot. That was the foreground story, and that I suppose that connected in my mind, because there's a lot of questions about, you know, mind and spirit and matter, and, you know, the different relationships between different sort of levels of being, kind of thing, and that sort of helped, that sort of connected with it in my mind. So
it's interesting because you obviously we know in SF the narratives involving artificial intelligence and a humanoid shape that goes way back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But there's been sort of a resurgence of that in sort of what we would call mainstream published fiction, like Ian McEwan did his book, and there's been Ishiguro's book. But
Yeah.
in terms of having read those people, and they have their merits, I mean, you were sort of obviously ahead of them chronologically, and in terms of complexity as well, I feel. And I think that the issue that really got me about the book was, you say, there's the foreground of the protagonist and his journey and what happens with the sex robot, where she becomes this kind of iconic figure, and also there's the background story as well. And that's something that I think SF does very well, that sometimes the mainstream struggles with. And I know you see yourself as a writer first, who just happens to write. A lot of SF does other things as well. But there is that wonderful thing where with a writer like you, we get the novel of ideas, but we also get the social novel in terms of the characterization and what have you as well. We get both things. And I think that's where your work is an excellent example of what literary SF can do. So, so that obviously it's quite, like, we think of it now, it's 18 years, isn't it? And I sell Holy Machine all the time, and I still pick it up and look at it now and again, and I recommend it to people in work all the time. And I just feel this is a powerful work, and you really caused a splash there. One thing I wanted to ask you about, there's a publishing question, because I'm always interested in this side of things, is that was Cosmos Wildside, who've done some great work. And then when your second novel, Marcher, came out, which I'm very fond of. I mean, you signed that for me with a load of other things. I've got a signature in your some if I find the full title page. There we go. And I love this. Obviously, it's set in Bristol, which is near to me, and I know you spent time in Bristol as well. And I was interested looking at this and Holy Machine, and obviously Holy Machine is available from Corvus in paperback and has been for years. And Marcher, there is the new Con edition, which is revised. There's a hardcover and a paperback. Though after this, I'm sure the hardcover will sell out rapidly. There can't be many left. And with this, I noticed this was it Dorchester Publishing? So you were published in the States first when it came to actual books. Is that correct, or am I missing something from the bibliography?
I was. Both of these books, I mean, they were published. These are, The Holy Machine and March are originally published by American small presses. That's right. March has been republished in a very different, quite radically different form by a British small press. March is the only book of mine that has never been published by a sort of major commercial publisher.
That's a major fail. I think Corvus need to get with the program, because I think March is a wonderful book. I really do.
I'm very fond of March. I think I had great difficulty. I can see why people have difficulty. I think it's, some of it is, some of it's among my best writing, but I found it difficult to finish. And if you see the two versions that exist, they've got completely different endings, actually, which is quite appropriate, because the book itself is obviously, it's got the old parallel timeline theme running through it, so it's quite appropriate. There are two parallel versions of this novel, but I still feel I'd almost, if somebody gave me, if I thought anyone would publish it, I'd quite like to write another version actually at some point and really nail that book, because I feel that again, it was very much the same preoccupation actually. That was, I was a social worker for many years, and I worked so I worked with people, and I live in Cambridge. I lived in Cambridge most of my adult life, and Cambridge, as you know, is a very prosperous, very middle-class town, which is wealthy because of high-tech industry, and of course a very famous university. I mean, but also very big in IT and biotechnology, and but on the fringes of Cambridge, which nobody knows about unless they're a social worker or unless they're one of those people, there's a lot of poor people actually living in quite poor environment. And
it's the same here in Bath. This is the thing. Is people
I imagine Bath is very similar, as is Bristol, is another example of a sort of rather pretty prosperous middle-class town which has its kind of hidden fringe, and people used to say to me, why do they need social workers in Cambridge? And I thought, well, you just say that because you've never been to the parts of Cambridge that I used to work in. Yeah. And it was so that lay behind Marcher, and also the idea of how alienating it would be to be poor and not very well educated, and who knows, perhaps sometimes not very bright either, in a city like this, which is all about being bright and and
yes, yeah,
and educated and so on, and how alienating that would be, and how, of course, you'd react against it. Of course you wouldn't want to be part of, of course you'd want to dismiss everything the city stood for. I mean, we haven't had a revolution in Cambridge as it happens, but but I was it struck me. This struck me very much. I mean, it struck me again in my. I mean, I make the connection with my Brexit novel, Two Tribes, where and again there I was thinking about. I live in Cambridge. This is, I think I'm right in saying, it was the most Remainy town in the country. 75% voted for Remain. Cambridge, about 40 miles away, Wisbech in northern Cambridgeshire, was one of the most leaviest places in the country, because it's a poor.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I was really struck by the demographics of that, and but we'll come back to that book later.
Yeah, we'll come on to Two Tribes later on.
It's a preoccupation that runs through you. I come from my father was a scientist, my mother was a doctor. I grew up in Oxford. I definitely come from the sort of the professional. I don't know, technocratic classes.
Yeah, that's exactly the word I was thinking. I mean, I'm the opposite. Obviously, I'm from Wales, as you know, and my grandfathers are miners, and my family worked in industry, and I worked in industry briefly myself, who I came a bookseller. So, but we unite intellectually. So this is the main thing. There are no class divides here with us. But I just wanted to sort of talk about Marcher because I really loved it, and I think I would love to see. I didn't realise that version from Newcom was a different text, so I'm going to buy myself that because I don't have that one. So I must get that. I'm going to get on the website a bit later on and buy it because I thought this was great. So guys, the audience out there, if you haven't read Marcher, as Chris said, there's not been a mass market edition for the UK. I can't recall where I got this, but I've had it for years and years and years. But it's fantastic stuff. And I think there was, even though there's lots of dark stuff in it, and there's lots of inventive stuff about the drug slip and the people coming from the parallel universe, the wonderful depiction of Bristol, which I really, really like knowing the city and knowing sort of every sort of bit of it, some bits better than others, and the outlying zones outside the sort of genteel parts, like Clifton, what have you. There's that thing where your characterization is really good, and there's amusing parts, and it's a fully rounded novel. So I think to say any publishers watching this, and get Corvus to have a look and tell them, I'd sell loads and loads of it. So guys, if you're watching out there, if you haven't read Marcher,
they wanted to publish another version of it, let me
know.
Well, I mean, basically the idea of it was it's set in Bristol, but around surrounding Bristol and surrounding all British cities, there are things called social inclusion zones,
yes,
which are where basically benefit claimants live, and they get money from the state, but in exchange for that, they have to surrender some of their civil liberties, basically, and then if they commit crimes, I think they're not allowed to leave the zone for a certain period, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I guess calling them social inclusion zone was a kind of joke. I was very amused to discover that the schools in Cambridge, they had what they call a social inclusion department, I think it was called, which was basically it wasn't for social inclusion, it was for exclusion. It's where the kids went when they weren't allowed in the mainstream. So it's very Orwellian, and I thought I'd pick that for my book. Yeah,
and that's very ironic, isn't it? It's interesting that I think every writer has a book which is unfairly obscure, and it's Marcher, so we get people to read that. Now, the Turing test. We must talk about the Turing test. Your first collection, here it is from Elastic Press, and this is a very interesting one because, folks, if you don't know the Turing test, this was the one which won the Edge Hill Prize, and the Edge Hill Prize is an annual prize for best short story collection in the UK. And I think was that the first time the Edge Hill Prize was awarded, or was it?
No, it'd been going for some time before that. I don't know how long.
Because their website's not very informative on that.
No, I think they'd been going for a number of years, and I think they had a brief period where the prize, they stopped stopped, and then I'm very pleased to see that they are in business again.
Good.
Because that prize was my big break, really, winning that prize.
Yeah, it
And
was. To talk about that, put some background in. I mean, a lot of people who know their SF and know the rest of history will know this. This is one of the sort of famous points in your career. But you were shortlisted alongside a number of sort of heavy hitters from the literary fiction end of things. Anne Enright, who'd won the Booker Prize, and she was really hot stuff back then. I was selling loads of her work. Sheena Mackay, and Sheena Mackay's very nice. I never met her. I talked to her on the phone once. I actually commissioned an essay from her for a literary diary that I edited back in 1998. And Ali Smith, who is a real darling currently of the Literati, very interesting writer of the establishment, but also experimental writer. And you sort of swept the board, and the judges, I think, were quoted as saying they didn't realize that they were science fiction fans till they'd read you, and that your stories were the best, which of course they are. And it's also, did that feel like a vindication, both of not just your writing, but of SF as the predominant literary genre in short forms? Because we all talk about how SF is important in short forms, but so did that feel like a win for you and for the genre as well?
Yeah. I mean, nothing against the other writers who I like. So a couple of them I've read their stuff and like it very much. But I felt very proud to have won, as an SF writer, to have won a prize that wasn't an SF prize. It was just a mainstream prize, and to have beat those very eminent people, and to get it. And I did feel I was striking a blow for science fiction as a form as well as for myself, and I felt very proud of that. Yeah, and I was, it was warming to see that I could tell, other people around felt the same thing, but I think SF is short stories in science fiction. Science fiction is great for short stories because you can establish a setting very quickly and just get straight in there, and it can be about interesting, complicated stuff in a very short story. And I think it's great.
Yeah, I think it's obviously short story markets have changed over the years and have changed an awful lot, and they're more difficult. There's things like Tor.com now. I personally can't read anything on a screen. I can, but I don't. I still like anthologies and what have you. But yeah, that was a great one. And it's funny because the Turing test obviously is something in AI studies, and since the book was published, and we're going to flash again because it's just so beautiful, that has become a element of AI studies which has become more prevalent and known in the mainstream media as well. So that was a win for you as well. But I remember reading I think it was in the Guardian back at the time, that at that point Elastic were about to fold as a company. Did that happen? Because it was kind of like a Pyrrhic victory for them.
They folded shortly afterwards. I say they. Elastic Press is basically one guy, Andrew Hook.
Yeah.
He's a good writer in his own right, actually, and he basically felt that he wanted to do more of his own writing,
not
spend all his time running Elastic Press, because what he did there was really a godsend to science fiction writers, because he created a short press, a small press that just published short story collections, which are notoriously difficult to get published, of course, so he was providing a really useful service to the community of writers.
Yeah, very much so. I think that it is that eternal thing where people say, "Oh, I don't like short stories. I'd like to get into something," and it's weird because we supposedly live in the age of the short attention span, don't we? Which is weird, and yet people.
I often wonder about that. Yeah, it's funny because you think we would like.
It's paradoxical, isn't it? It's one of the paradoxes of sort of postmodern culture. I mean, the other thing is that it's almost analogous in a way to the resurgence of the vinyl record, which is like a ritual. It's complex to put on. You've got to look after it, what have you, and yet young people particularly, are getting really into it because it's the iconography. So if only we could do the same for short stories. But I think funny
enough, a short story collection, although you'd think short stories were good for people with short attention spans, actually for each story you've got to kind of focus again, whereas if you're reading a great blockbuster book, once you're in it, and so actually in a funny way it's easier to concentrate on a long book than it is on a short story collection. Each story requires you set aside the last story and then gather yourself for the next story. And I can see in a way why it's difficult, but
yeah, it's the investment, isn't it? People do say that to me. Customers say that to me when I work in a bookshop. They say to me that is the thing, you've got to get into it, and that's what I kind of love about it. And for me, I mean, I wouldn't say all my favorite writers are great at short stories, but most of my favorite writers, the writers I really revere, I often feel the short story is a real test of them. I mean, a classic example of that is somebody like John Harrison. I know you'll know Mike's work, and I mean, some of his short stories, I love the novels, but the short stories are just astonishing, and it's the same with your work. Your short stories are fantastic, and we'll move back onto a few more of those a bit later on. So your career was sort of coming together as an SF writer. Then you had your own sort of work careers outside that, which have been successful, writing textbooks and lecturing and what have you. And then came an even bigger one, Dark Eden, and the two sequels, the Eden Trilogy. And here it is in Corvus, and the jacket has changed recently. I'll flash that up on the screen. You'll see all the jackets on the screen in the finished video. And that you won the Arthur C. Clarke Award for that. That must have been a real thrill.
It was a very big thrill, yeah. I mean, and of course that was another huge step forward. I mean, the Turing test kind of broke the ground for it, kind of thing.
Yeah,
made it possible for me to get my the Holy Machine republished and Dark Eden published by a commercial publisher. Yeah, winning that prize was a huge fillip for me, and yeah, it was a magical moment. I felt that it's this kind of thing is very validating because as a writer, particularly if you haven't been particularly successful, it's certainly not commercially successful up to that point. You're always full of doubt. You think, well, maybe I'm just not very good. You win a prize and you think, I must be good. I must be quite good at this.
Yeah.
And it's a nice kind of ground that you can then stand on. Although of course it's always the other way. It's also of course you think, oh, how can I equal that? There's always you always find a reason to doubt yourself one way or another.
Yeah. Well, I think when you're an artist, you have to be your own sternest critic, don't you? And I think most writers I've talked to are, and and that's the right thing to do. And of course, I think if people haven't read Dark Eden, it gets compared to lots of things. It gets compared to Lord of the Flies. For me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I could feel the influence or the inspiration. And when Chris Priest and I were talking the other day, he was saying the thing about literary influence is it's not copying, it's possibilities and opening ideas up. But I felt that maybe I was reminded of Brian Aldiss, particularly books like Hot House and Non-Stop, with the world building and the wonderful range of ideas of depicting the alien world, and also the sort of Hegira, the journey that the characters go on, and the transformational conceptual breakthroughs and things. So obviously that was an important thing to produce a series and to get the trilogy out there, and people really loved it. And you've stepped back from the idea of doing series since. And I have mixed feelings about this. There are series I like. I'm generally a singleton guy, and I generally feel that SF usually works best when you have that introductory thing, you have the paradigm shift, the world is created, and then at the end you have that sort of quantum punch of at the end of the story, and the world is transformed yet again. And you sort of stepped away from that. And in as much as the trilogy is fantastic, I'm very glad you moved on to singletons, because it seems to me an awful lot of writers these days are stuck in this thing where publishers want series all the time. Have you ever felt that pressure? Or have you just sort of forged on and done what you felt was your thing?
Well, I think my current publisher's Corvus would have liked me to carry on writing not more Eden books, but more things more like the Eden books, because they were just they sold well, and I think a lot of people enjoyed the Eden books because it's a very immersive world, and I love creating this very immersive world. And my more recent books, well, possibly Beneath the World of Sea, is also quite what's intended to be quite an immersive kind of world. The other one's slightly less so because they're more naturalistic, But I mean, I guess publishers would have liked me to carry on, write another trilogy like Dark Eden, but not Dark Eden, like the Eden Trilogy. I mean, the thing is, it's a question of what you got in you, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't have minded if I'd got that. I mean, that book was, although the book came out, it was 2012. It was a very long time in the making, you know. And you know, the first short stories that were sort of prototypes were, I think the first one was a story called The Circle of Stones, which was published in 1992. You know, so it gives you an idea. 20 years before the novel, has basically includes versions of the main characters and the sort of big moment at the beginning of the novel as well. You know, so you know, you can't necessarily just reproduce that same thing again.
Absolutely no. But I think you know, something that gets me about series is that, and you see this with young writers, and we know now that publishing has changed a lot in my time in the book trade, and there's an awful lot of 3 strikes and you're out now, and obviously you came in through short stories and the small presses and stuff, and it's really worked for you. And it's an interesting thing. I've seen young writers who they have their first book out and the publishers commissioned a trilogy, and I put the blame for this on the sort of boom in fantasy writing since the late 70s, and it's one of my things I go on about, so do forgive me. But you know, it's that thing where a first book will come out, it might have great reviews. If people don't like it, or not enough people like it, then the second volume comes out, the sales decline, and then the third one's doomed, and then the writer's career can be over, and it's a terrible thing. And you know, it does come from publishers wanting to sort of replicate that thing, because not everybody wants the same sort of books, you know, and that does worry me. But speaking about your later work, which I want to come on to now, it's an interesting thing. I see thematic things in your work, and to me, if I look at your work over the last 4 books, through America City, Beneath the World to Sea, Two Tribes, and Tomorrow, to my way of thinking, this is probably only to my way of thinking, you seem to have produced 2 thematic diptychs. So I see links between America City and Two Tribes, and also links between Beneath the World to Sea and Tomorrow. And yet, you know, they weren't written together that way.
No.
They're 4 separate books, but there's that sort of wave of when then it goes back. And it's interesting, if we look at the Eden books as, say, a single work, so you've got Holy Machine, very much definite SF. Marcher is SF, but has a more sort of social, sort of near future, new wavy sort of feel, if I can say that. And then we go to Dark Eden, which is more traditional SF. Then we go back to the newer books. So, you know, you are sort of moving between those 2 things of the intense world building, and then we get things which are more obviously related to our real world. So I think in a way that, you know, you are doing series thematically, it's just publishers won't see it that way, and it's an interesting way of looking at it. So I think to talk about America City and Two Tribes, the last time we met, we were obviously talking about America City because it was new then, and obviously, it was written before Donald Trump got into his big sort of shenanigans, and in a big way. And I remember us talking about that. But the book is sort of more about, I thought, the dangers of social media and its effects on our current consciousness. And you know, there's the whisper stream in the book. There's the futuristic sort of kind of Twitter, isn't it? And you know, are you still worried about what's happening with the world through social media? Was that the spur behind America City? And you know, have things got worse or better?
Well, I suppose America City. I ought to write a book about climate change. That was the first thing that, you know, came by. So it's about a world suffering the consequences, specifically America suffering the consequences of climate change, in the sense that the southern states of America, some of the southern states are becoming uninhabitable in areas, you know, due to drought or constant hurricanes and things like that. So there's an internal migration within America, and that created a political tension, which the book is all about. But that was the idea there. And as I started writing it, and trying to think how I was going to do it, I been thinking more about social media and about how people could be manipulated with social media, and I suspect although the whisper stream and so on is more sophisticated than what we got now, it's in the sense that, for example, the social media platforms can monitor the people's heart rate and things like that to figure out what interests them and what emotionally connects with them. So it's more sophisticated than we got now. I suspect that it's going to get a lot more sophisticated than
Yeah,
I could
absolutely.
imagine.
It's quite a frightening vision, because we see in America City when Holly, the sort of main character, despite her sort of feelings about politics and ethics and what have you, she takes the opportunity to work for the senator, Senator Slaymaker, isn't it? And he, obviously there's an analog there. It was easy for people to see Donald Trump, and you're using the classic SF metaphor there. The book is set about 100 years from now. And the consequences are just sort of staggering. And it's that thing where, you have to sort of worry about what you do yourself in the public domain. And we see Holly go on that journey, and it's fascinating stuff. But it's climate change is something which comes up in quite a few of your books, isn't it? I mean, obviously Springtide, the recent collection of short stories. Yeah.
Well, let's say, by the way, just to say about Donald Trump, I'd say that Slaymaker isn't so much a crude parody of Donald Trump as the other way around, actually. I mean, my character, Slaymaker, was a much more rounded individual than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I actually, Slaymaker was a right-wing politician who cared about nothing except America and what happened beyond America's borders, and was to even in a future where the effects of climate change are really undeniable, he still questioned whether human beings had anything to do with it. He was had imperial ambitions on neighbouring states, which I won't say more about because that's a little story. But nevertheless, I quite liked him, actually, and his my character Holly really liked him, although she was liberal politically in her own mind. She really took to this guy. He became a kind of father figure to her. They had a kind of father-daughter thing going on, which I bought into that. I could see that would work, and he was quite a charming character in my mind, Slaymaker, which Trump really isn't, is he? I mean, I suppose
it's actual charisma, isn't it?
Yeah. So I just want to say that. I mean, the relationship between Slaymaker and Holly was the core of the story, and I found it interesting and I enjoyed that. But basically, Slaymaker wants to win a presidential election, and Holly is a professional manipulator of social media, and she does it for him by basically just ruthlessly playing to people's feelings, and making things up, and also targeting particular groups of people with the messages they want to hear and so forth,
Yeah. And this is what we're seeing in social media now, but as you say, it's not yet. It can't really monitor a heart rate yet. That would probably.
You can't monitor heart rate. No, in Holly's day, she can actually tell whether people are emotionally responding to messages. But it's not so different nowadays. I mean, they can monitor it by the fact that we stay looking at things.
Absolutely.
They work out how long we stay looking at things, and they use essentially conditioning people to looking at things. It's pretty ruthless what happens now.
It is, isn't it? But it's a great novel, and I think again it's that thing where what I love about so much of your work is that there's that thing where the relevance to the real world is there, and there's the old Philip K. Dick thing, which Philip K. Dick said, that space adventure fiction wasn't really science fiction because there's nothing new in it. But I mean, you're always mirroring things in the real world, and as any of us who love SF, whether we're readers, writers, commentators, we've always said that it's always about what's happening now rather than what's happening in the future. It's just a metaphor, and I think Two Tribes, which to me seems thematically linked, even though they don't follow each other. You've got Beneath the World of Sea in between. I want to come back to that a bit later on. But Two Tribes, obviously was very much the Brexit novel. And I think what I thought was brilliant about Two Tribes, apart from my enjoyment of the story itself, was the fact that it reminded me rather of what Jean-Luc Godard did in Alphaville, the SF film from the 50s, where, of course, in SF we have this thing where the tropes are often metaphors for things in our world. And what you did in Two Tribes, which I loved, was that you have the character in the future where you have, she's an archivist and is looking back. Zoe is in the 23rd century dystopian future, and her job is to sort of preserve the past. And she's looking back to the time of Brexit in the UK. and then she starts to create this narrative. So it's a metafictional thing. She starts to create this fiction about two characters called Harry and Michelle, who are on different sides of the Brexit debate. And, you know, in as much as that reminded me of one of my favorite books, Christopher Priest's The Affirmation, where there's a narrative within which may or may not be fictional. It was really clever because instead of just doing an SF thing set in the future that was a metaphor for what was happening in Brexit, they actually looked back to Brexit. It was a science fiction novel look back at the present, rather than just looking forward. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And you know, this was really groundbreaking to me. And did you feel that when you were writing it? Was it something that you very much wanted to sort of ground the narrative and the arguments around Brexit by putting that little bit of distance, but not too much?
Exactly so. And yes, I mean, yeah. So in fact, what I did really was that the framing device is science fiction. It's about this, as you say, this archivist in the future, and she is writing a historical novel about Brexit. Yeah, and but she's writing a historical novel based on, you know, within her own terms, real facts. She's got some diaries, real people. So she's using their story, but she's adding material, you know, like historical novelists do. She's adding extra material to make it into a story, and some of the material isn't historically accurate. You know, she just added stuff.
Yeah.
You know, so we'll make it work. You know, so we see various scenes taking place which didn't take place during the Brexit debate. One character gets involved in a kind of paramilitary organisation on the Leave side. Well, there wasn't a paramilitary organisation on the Leave side.
No, I didn't notice one.
Yeah. So, you know, for example, that happens. So it's quite complicated because it kind of goes back and forth. But the core of it, there's a quite simple story actually, which is a kind of love story between a sort of very middle class, privately educated architect who voted Remain and a hairdresser from rural Norfolk who voted Leave, and they met by accident because his car broke down outside this town in Norfolk, and he needed somewhere to stay the night, and he stayed. And she she let a room on Airbnb, you know, so that's how she met her.
Yeah, and again, there's you know, the themes in your work are sort of consistent. I mean, that relates again to the two sort of views of Brexit. It's rather like in Marcher, where there's the socially excluded people and what have you. The two things are there. So, and your work, the beauty of your work in that way is that you never hit people over the head with a hammer. You know, you just present the different views to the characters. With a little sort of SF twists on them. And I think that's just absolutely fantastic. It works really well. So what do you think of my theory? And, you know, are America City and Two Tribes, are they a thematic diptych, or am I just making this up?
No, you're not making it up. I can see why you're connecting it. Because I mean, they're both about the very, in a fairly straightforward way about present day political issues, you know, in a way that, I mean, Dark Eden is much more obliquely about more
Yes, yeah.
So it's much less. So it's very much about present day political issues in a way that my other novels aren't, and you know, so yeah, no, they are a pair in that sense. But it's funny, all my novel hats on, and I'm distracted by seeing my hat's got all funny. Just tugging at them on. I'm wearing it because my room is rather cold, by the way. But you know, there are all kinds of connections between my books, some of which other people might not spot. For example, America City, in my mind, is thematically linked with the second Eden novel, Mother of Eden. Because they have this relationship between the ambitious young woman and a ruthless but charming older man. Not a sexual relationship, but a strong relationship. Not an explicitly sexual anyway. In America City, it's between Holly and Slavemaker, and in Mother of Eden, it's between the main character Starlight and the father of her husband, who's called Firehand.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but now you said it.
He actually dies quite early in the novel, but Holly was fascinated. Not Holly, sorry, see, I'm Freudian slip. I'm mixing them up now. Starlight was fascinated by Firehand, and they kind of recognize something of each other straight away. Firehand doesn't last very far into the novel. So I guess in a way, those two books were linked as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in my mind, there's all kinds of connections between the books which aren't necessarily obvious to the reader, or they aren't thematic links in the normal sense. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry,
Well, that's the beauty of reading, an author's work and seeing. I mean, there's one theory, isn't there, about art, which is that most artists have one idea and they approach it from different angles and different things with it. And I think that's entirely valid. And I love a lot of my favorite artists do that. And they that's how you create a persona as an individual artist. I think that's a great thing. But I hadn't thought of that. I must look at that again. So, but moving on to the other thematic diptychs, which I'm seeing again, Beneath the World of Sea and Tomorrow. And I read Beneath the World recently, and I thought it was fantastic. The Latin American setting, the string, and it's I want to talk about it again just for the audience who might not have read it. You've got the Latin American setting. There's a strange zone there in which if people go into this zone, you can live there, and it's quite sort of reasonably safe and what have you. But when you come out, you forget everything. There are strange beings called duendes there. Which I looked them up on Wikipedia because I know a book called Duende, which is about Spanish flamenco, funnily enough. And I didn't realize that duendos were these rather international sort of elven type characters. I didn't realize they were a real thing in terms of cryptozoology. I'd not come across them. And I quite well read in there, so that was a surprise. And you've got a wonderful cast of characters there. And I think one thing I really liked in Beneath the World of Sea is that you've got Ben, the cop, and then you've got a number of female characters who are sort of quite foregrounded. They're not subordinate in any way. So that's really sort of attractive sort of casting. And then there's these sort of very strange when you like a book, because there are characters you like, and then you find there's parts of them you don't like, and there's characters you dislike. They're properly faceted, and I think I really sort of reacted to Jail and Rico, and some of Ben's meditations on Jail and Rico being this annoying hippie character and what have you, and the way that Jail was super intelligent. And I'm not making a great job of explaining this for the audience out there, but I think you just have to read Beneath the World to see. And I felt that there's references in the book to other SF. There's little references to Stanislaw Lem, the Strugatskys. And again, people have compared it to Conrad, which is as soon as you have anything with boats in the jungle, people go to Heart of Darkness, don't they? You can't get away from it. But I felt more that it was more in Lucia Shepherd's terrain, but your style is quite different to Lucia's early work. And tonally and message-wise, what you do is quite different. But it's a beautiful, mysterious book that really lingers in the mind. And the whole thing about the zone novel, is that becoming a subgenre now? Did you feel very much that there was a certain amount of homage to the Strugatsky type thing when you're doing it?
Certainly, the zone was meant to be a homage to Strugatsky, to the novel Roadside Picnic and the film Stalker that was based on it. Yeah, which so definitely, and I named one of the characters Strugatsky by way of kind of giving an acknowledgement. The zone, of course, in my novel was a kind of thing you pass through to get to another thing called the submundo, which is where the duendes lived, and once you got into the submundo, you were in a very strange part of the world where biology is completely different from the rest of the world. I mean, people don't know why, but that they theorized either it was extraterrestrial in origin, or it's just simply an entirely different biological line from the rest of life on Earth, which it could happen, couldn't it? You could have and the duendes have got this sort of apparently sort of telepathic ability, which is very disturbing to people who live around them.
There's kind of an environmental thing, isn't there? Because Ben, the policeman, is sent out to the zone and the area around it because the natives, the local people, the indigenous people, are killing the duendes and have done for a long time. And there's the species protection thing, and something that comes across a lot in the book is the colours. The magenta, which is on the jacket, and how everything is sort of magenta and white. And it's an interesting thing, something that people often focus on when they write novels set in jungles is they go on about the heat, and you don't. You sort of go in there, and the heat is kind of in the relationships between the characters, isn't it? I think, but it's just a great book, and I love the mesh of very, very definite SF tropes, but done in a really interesting and unique way. But at the same time, it felt metafictional in the way that, say, Priest the Affirmation is, where there's this sort of forgetting zone and what have you. And it's marvelous stuff. So with that book, then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, shortly after that, Springtide, the short story collection, came out, and you certainly seem to be moving into a new area tonally. To me as a reader, you're engaging a lot with ambiguity and subtlety, and it's quite unsettling, but it's really, really good. So do you feel a sea change in your own style as you move through the books?
Yeah, I think so. Some of them have a, how can I say it? I think some of them are more kind of metaphysical, and some of them are more political. Yeah, if you put it that way. Yeah. So I think Beneath the World of Sea is more of a metaphysical. I'm not sure I'm using the word correctly, but that's the word.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. It's also, in a way, it's the part of the story is about a man's descent into his own subconscious, really. And there's definitely a Ballard influence on the.
Oh yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, anyway, I was very consciously channeling things like the Crystal World and things like that. But by the way, the Conrad influence, yeah, definite. And in fact, I named the captain of the boat,
yes,
Korzeniowski, after Conrad's real name. But so I was trying to channel, Heart of Darkness, that kind of descent into the subconscious was what the whole thing was about, really. And the Duendes had this uncomfortable effect of being able to channel people's unconscious thoughts, or not necessarily unconscious, but thoughts they don't want to, don't want to acknowledge, and bring them to the surface. So that it was all about that, really. So it was it's a very different place from The Holy Machine or America City, which
very much so. I felt
which are more sort of in more taking place in the social and political realms.
I think it seemed to me I could see Crystal World in there, and I could see we're working within a tradition. I mentioned Lucius Shepard, but at the same time, it's entirely your own. And obviously, the magical realism. As soon as you talk about literature in South America, that comes up. And I think of people like Borges and what have you. But it's very much your own. But something I loved about the book is that I do like mystery, and I like it when things aren't neat, because in real life things are not neat, are they? Lots of things are unresolved, and Ben, when he discovers certain things about himself, we won't go too far with those, we don't want any spoilers or anything, but I thought it was marvelous stuff, and I'm annoyed with myself that I left it so long. So from now on, every time when your book comes out, I read it straight away, which is what I normally do. So I don't know what happened there. So guys, if you haven't read Beneath the World of Sea, get it and buy it now, okay?
My wife thinks it's my best book. She also says, well, I'm not sure I'd take this as a compliment. It's also, she says, it's the most grown-up book. And I know what she means, actually, and I think it possibly is my best book, actually, in many ways, yeah. But so I do, would like people to read it more.
It's great stuff.
Can I just pick up what you said about neatness, because I so agree. I really dislike neatness, actually, in writing, and right, no, I don't. It depends what you mean by neatness, obviously. But I like writing to be, well structured and so forth. But I'm very opposed to wrapping everything up neatly at the end and just saying and suddenly it's all solved like a whodunit. I don't want to do that. And sometimes I see reviews of my books on Amazon and things like that. People say, well, didn't think much of the ending, and I think was too bad, because that's how I like the book. To me.
Well, that's a conventional expectation, is it? And I'm always saying with SF particularly that, because it's one of the sort of things I see as an element of SF is the sort of cognitive dissonance. And if you want to read something that is neat and all ties up, then you read a golden age detective novel. You don't read you read SF and experimental and modernist writing to wake you up, to have the bucket of water in the face. And neatness is kind of the enemy of that, isn't it? It's like a good structured narrative, but it is the enemy of that.
I think that's true, although I think it's also true that a certain kind of SF, people expect at the end of it that all the mysterious things that were going on should all be explained, and they should understand. So beneath the world of the sea, that doesn't happen. You don't, I mean, you during the course of the book, characters theorize about what's going on and have ideas and so on, but you don't at the end suddenly think, what was really going on was this, and the same with the Eden books. Some people wanted to. I noticed some people wanted to have a much more of a resolution. Because life isn't like that. It doesn't all get resolved. You resolve some things, other things don't get resolved. New questions rise themselves, and life goes on. And that to me is good. I sometimes think that I've sometimes read books that I've really enjoyed, and at the end, the authors felt obliged to tie it all up. And I feel like, and it felt like to me like an act of vandalism, really, because they've created this wonderful world, and at the end, they've just sort of trashed it by going at the end.
The box is closed, isn't it? And that's the end.
You don't want that. So I'm in favour of books do move from A to B, obviously, but they don't tie up very neatly at the end.
I think there's a way of doing it. I mean, I think if you look at one of the sort of classic modern SF novels, Neuromancer by William Gibson, obviously it's part of a trilogy, and the themes are the important thing. And at the end of Neuromancer, there's a wonderful line, and every time I read it, I get something different out of that book, where Gibson writes, "Case never saw Molly again." So it is kind of wound up, but at the same time, emotionally, it's left sort of hanging in lots of ways. But the bigger picture in the novel is about the freedom experienced by the AIs and what have you. But yeah, I mean, it's this whole sort of thing for neatness. And I as a seasoned SF reader, even when I was younger, when I read Durandra's Dream of Electric Sheep when I was at 14, it struck me that there was an awful lot to the story which was unresolved, and that's why it was beautiful, and that's what I get out of Beneath the World of Sea. So maybe your wife's right, but I want to move on to Tomorrow.
We just say to Andrew's Dream of Electric Sheep, possibly my favourite novel, or one of my very favourite novels. I love that. I love it. I've read it many times.
We will come on to that. I'm going to ask you about some of your faves towards the end, but Tomorrow. I was blown away by Tomorrow, and I think to me it shows you moving even further into a fascinating area. And to me, it reminded me the way I felt when I read it. It created similar, but not the same, similar feelings to when I first read Ice by Anna Kavan. The way that the character, the sort of character's consciousness is emerging, and Chris Priest, the affirmation element, again, a keynote work for me. And it seemed to be a further consolidation of your sort of mode. And you say you'd rather be thought of as a writer first rather than just an SF writer. And it was a metafictional book, a book about stories, about writing. And, I thought it was wonderful and very, very bold. And were you happy with it? Were you happy with its wonderfully unresolved and sort of tense and multifaceted thing? I thought it was an absolute triumph. Were you happy with it? Or do you see it just a stepping stone to the next thing?
Oh, I'm happy with it. I wanted to write a book like that. It isn't really a science fiction novel in many respects, in the sense that it's set in a more or less contemporary setting, but it has got many sort of science fictional elements, in the sense that it's set in a completely imaginary place and imaginary country, and it has different wildlife and things like that. So if you like world building, there's plenty of that going on, but it's not.
And of course, can I just stop you there and say that, of course, when Beneath the World of Sea is set in 1990 as well, isn't it? It's not set in the future, so there's a kind of similar thing there.
It's true. Actually, Marcia is also meant to be set in an alternative present rather than the future. But it's Beneath the World of Sea is set in 1990. For some reason, I decided I wanted to have it before mobile phones and all that.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
But Tomorrow is more or less contemporary. People do have phones and everything, but the guy or the main character, anyway, let's call him that. Call them the main character, is in a jungle and hasn't got any way of contacting the rest of the world. So that's a bit similar.
and he's always about to start writing his book. And I mean,
Yeah.
that's an interesting, because the procrastination. I mean, I'm the world's laziest writer. I've written some non-fiction and a little bit of short fiction. And I mean, one of the reasons Tom Toner, the SF writer, always says to me, Steve, you know too much. That's the trouble. And not, but for every writer, the blank page of the blank screen is a problem, isn't it? You know, it's one of those things. So I loved the fact that it was fiction about fiction as well. And I don't want to say too much about tomorrow, because I don't think we can, because of the way the book is structured. But I just want to urge everybody who likes the cutting edge, because I really feel it's one of the most important cutting edge works of fiction in recent years. And as you say, it is SF and it's not, but that's the beauty of it. It's this sort of slipstream thing, isn't it? And moving on to your influences, and I mean, my thing very much is, you know, if people said to me, what do you like more than anything in the world, I would say I love English literary SF in a certain period, and I like the people who sort of came out of that. And you know, I may be completely wrong, so you must correct me, but I see you very much as coming out of that school that we've always had in Britain from H.G. Wells onwards, of the literary writer who just happens to use SF tropes, and that sort of culminated in the new wave of people like Ballard, Priest, Moorcock, M. John Harrison, those sort of people, and then later on people like Robert Holdstock and Gary Kilworth. And you know, as one of the preeminent writers of your generation related to SF, you know, am I right? Do you see yourself as part of that legacy, or?
Well, I certainly, the writers that I admire are included in the ones I most admire, including the ones you mentioned. I mean, I love Ballard, particularly Ballard's short stories that I admire hugely, and I do love the thing that he does with. I mean, lately he stopped calling himself a science fiction writer, didn't he? And but he still has that kind of
It's in the future.
That indefinable weirdness which we associate with good science fiction. You know, that sort of tingly strangeness. You know, but I love what he done, and I think I also, and you haven't mentioned it, but Brian Aldiss, I think you did mention it here actually. Brian Aldiss, and you were quite right. He was an influence on Dark Eden. I think the Heliconia trilogy was wonderful, and I certainly took some lessons on world building from the Heliconia trilogy. It wasn't one of his most successful books, I don't think, but I thought it was great. So yeah, those two writers. I'm also a huge fan of Philip Dick, which is obviously not an British writer. Another British writer I hugely admire, who is partly a science fiction writer, is Doris Lessing.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that would be a number of her novels are very definitely science fictional. So, Briefing for a Descent into Hell, for example, The Memoirs of a Survivor, which is sort of set in a kind of dystopian future. You know, that woman had a phenomenal imagination, and a sort of, a bit like Ballard, a kind of what do you call it? Sort of high road to her own subconscious, you know.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, now correct me if I'm wrong. Now, you did some archival work for the British Library on Ballard, didn't you?
No,
it wasn't you.
People often say that, but
there's another Chris Beckett, isn't it?
Chris Beckett. There's also another Chris Beckett who's a poet that I often get confused with as well.
Yeah, so because I was sure that it wasn't you who did the work on the Ballard thing, and I said that some in the channel, and then I got the impression for some that it was you, and I thought, no, it can't be, because we had talked about it. But speaking about Ballard, I mean, it just flashed in my head, talk about the short stories and things like The Terminal Beach, and I mean, The Drowned Giant is the one that always sticks in my head. That's great stuff. But moving on to sort of contemporary writers, who do you like who's a practitioner now? You know, obviously we talk about those influences. Who are the people who turn you on now? Who are the exciting writers now for you?
I'm going to admit something, that I read fairly little in the way of fiction nowadays, and I don't read very much science fiction anymore. So it's difficult for me to really name names. I mean, a good friend of mine, Tony Ballantyne, I'm massive fan of, and
is that the guy he wrote? Is it Twisted Metal?
Yep, that's him.
Yeah,
that's him.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
He wrote two. That was a sad example. He wrote something you spoke about earlier. He wrote 2 volumes of I thought, a very clever trilogy that was all basically set on a world where there was nobody except robots, you know.
Yeah.
And he did a marvelous job with that.
Yeah, he beat C. Robert Cargill to that, didn't he? And the third volume never appeared, which was a
never
shame.
appeared because the publishers decided to pull the plug on him. This is one of the distressing things about being a writer, is you're only as far as your publishers are concerned, you're only as good as the sales of your last book, you know. But he's written lots of other stuff as well. He wrote the Recursion series as well. That was a complete trilogy, and very, very. He's
good. I read Twisted Metal. It was very good.
There's a little bit of Philip Dick in there, I think.
Yeah, very much so.
I haven't read very much science fiction in recent years, I'm going to admit with you.
But that's a common thing, isn't it? I mean, you talk to most SF writers who've got a broad base in what they do and have a background in sort of literary fiction as well and reading. I mean, I can remember going back to the 80s, talking to people like Chris Priest, M. John Harris, and Michael Moorcock, and they'd say they wouldn't read much genre fiction, and non-fiction is a big thing. You learn a lot. I read a lot of non-fiction myself, and you learn a lot from it, and it can be inspirational for fiction writing.
I do read a lot of non-fiction. I don't know whether other writers would agree with me, but I think sometimes when you are a writer and you make up fiction, it is actually harder to read fiction because, and the analogy I always give is that if you're a puppeteer and you watch a puppet show, you can't. It's more difficult to surrender to the illusion because you know what's happening behind the scene.
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking at the technique and what have you.
You can't help it. And so if you or me go to a puppet show, we'll be able to just give way to the illusion, but the puppeteer would find it hard, and I do find that a little bit harder, particularly with science fiction, actually, because. But I occasionally I do discover. I mean, a writer I've discovered this year, Stephen, you haven't come across, not a science fiction writer at all, a neglected writer from the middle of the last century, Patrick Hamilton. Have you ever read any of his books?
Yes, yeah.
But
it's something you don't hear about much these days. Yeah.
He's very well. He's a writer's writer. Lots of writers really admire him. He wrote the plays on which the film Gaslight was based, and also the film Rope was based. He wrote also some amazing novels, and check out The Slaves of Solitude. It's fantastic.
Yeah, he's sort of he's related. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm thinking he's sort of like they're not exactly a school, but there's sort of certain period mid-century writers who set things in London, around London. I'm familiar with that sort of end. And there's people, there's some good writers. Obviously, you think of Orwell, you think of people like Julian McLaren Ross. And Norman Collins. I'm thinking commercially here, the way I sell these books, they're sort of London novels. Alexander Barrett's another one. So yeah, well, maybe I'll look at a bit more with your recommendation there. But that's great. So finally, before we sort of break off and just have a chat amongst ourselves, we're sort of wondering really, are you working on something now, or what is next?
Well,
I'll say
I've had a bit of a pause in my writing. Tomorrow, I actually wrote in 2020. I actually wrote it during the lockdown, actually, the first lockdown. I wrote the original draft very quickly in the first lockdown. That's obviously, so it's a lockdown novel in a way, although it isn't very obvious from reading it, apart from the fact that the main character, who actually hasn't got a name, you actually don't know what. You don't learn very much about the character except that they're the narrator of the story. They were isolated in a cabin by a river, so I suppose that's a kind of lockdown situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've taken a break, so we have to wait and see what happens.
I'm working at the moment on an idea, and it's just very much an idea, which is to do with generation ships. That's all. Yeah. So I'm intrigued by the idea of. So I guess I'm moving slightly more back into a more straightforward science fictional thing. But I find myself intrigued by what it would be like to be the third generation born on a generation ship.
It's always been a fascinating thing, hasn't it? It's one of those recurrent sort of subgenres that pops back. It was very hard to do really well, and I look forward to that, and I hope that goes well.
I do it well. I mean, there's Non-Stop by Brian Orders, of course, is a generation ship novel, which is
That's the one, isn't it? Really? Yeah. There's an obscure one by an American writer called Molly Gloss. Have you ever come across that one?
Is that no?
Yeah, she's sort of like a Lagan type figure. I know it's easy to say that about American female writers. I can't think what it's called, so I will let you know. But it's a sort of print on demand thing. I read an amazing story by her in an anthology about 15 years ago, and I picked up this novel, and it's really, really good. So we don't want to spoil the magic, so hold that thought. We look forward to that, and you and I'll have a chat. And we'll say bye to everybody now. So I just wanted to say here, thanks to Chris. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming on board. And for those of you who are familiar with Chris's books, I'm sure you really enjoyed that. And for those of you who aren't, there's some ideas what you can read, and you must read Chris's stuff because, he has entertained, enlightened me for well over a decade now. I was late to the party. I'm ashamed to say I didn't start reading until about 2010. I should have been more with it, but it's been fantastic stuff, and your work it's just been an absolute joy. So do keep it up, dear boy. You really must, because we need more work of the sort of quality that you produce. So this is Outlaw Bookseller with Chris Beckett. That's bye from me and bye from Chris.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
It's been a blast, mate, as always, as always. So we'll switch off recording now, and you and I can have a chat. Bye for now, everybody.
Bye bye.